Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Aviation Nerd Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Richardson, and today we have a very special guest. Cary Rickoff, callsign Chewy, was a fighter pilot in the United States Navy for a little over 15 years, and he even flew with the Blue Angels from 2019 to 2022. In this episode, we'll talk about how he went from a kid dreaming of being a pilot to being a Blue Angel pilot, and now being a pilot for one of the major U.S. airlines and still flying for the military on the weekend. So please welcome Cary Rickoff, callsign Chewy, to the podcast. All right, so welcome. Thank you so much. Like I said, thank you so much for being willing to do this. So you've had a very interesting and fascinating and career, as I've learned about. But I want to take it back to the beginning. So you grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, right? And around there, you were probably, I can imagine you were exposed a little bit to the world of aviation, probably. But I was just curious, what was your first memory of aviation, and what kind of inspired you to go down this path?
Absolutely, yeah. So, spread on. I was born and raised outside of Atlanta. Um, and just like I think as a kid in general, I always liked aviation. Grew up watching Top Gun, so those are some of my early memories. Watching the F-14s and stuff on TV. But kind of at the same time, parallel. My grandparents were from Pensacola, so we grew up going to Pensacola all the time. So I would see the Blue Angels, and I think every time we'd go down there, I'd want to go to the Naval Aviation Museum. And so we'd walk through there and see all the planes. And so it all started, I just had a big fascination with planes in general. And just so happened most of those were military planes. Kind of at the same time as well, my uncle is a private pilot. So I got to see his, Cessna and stuff. And that's actually where I learned I took my first flight lessons were in his plane. So um, I would say it's kind of a family thing, but from different aspects of the family. One side is my dad's side that lived in Pensacola, so we got to see all that stuff. The other side is my mom's side, who actually is a pilot, so got the interest there. So I wouldn't say one specific source, but just kind of a culmination of things as a child and always liking airplanes.
Nice. So you did end up for college. I believe, from what I read, you went to Duke.
Mhm.
Did you were you in ROTC, or did you go to OCS later? Okay.
No,
So
no, yeah, ROTC at Duke.
so how did you decide on Duke? And you were heading for a military career at this point, I imagine.
hmm Exactly. So as I kind of said, I got my private pilot's license in high school, and that's kind of when I found out about the ROTC program and realized that essentially they would pay you to go to school, and then you come out and go fly afterwards. Uh, but Duke for me was just I wanted to stay in the southeast. I'm from Atlanta, so I didn't want to be too far from home. Still wanted a good school. At the time, my brother was also at Duke, so that had a leg up on a lot of other schools. But luckily, the three schools I wanted to go to, I was applying to Duke, Tulane, and University of Florida. All had ROTC programs, so I kind of looked for schools around me that had that program, and those three kind of fit.
Nice. So then after graduation, and of course, because you were in ROTC, you got commissioned, and then you went to flight school. So how was flight school? Was it challenging? Did it come easy for you? How was it?
Both. Flight school is challenging, just because everyone wants to do their best and get the number one spot and pass, obviously, and become a naval aviator. But um, you also just came from college, so it is challenging, but nothing you can't handle. And the Navy school does a really good job of kind of walking you down the path, and there's no surprises. This is the stuff you need to learn. We're going to teach you that stuff. So um, it's nothing too crazy. It's just, can you learn quick enough? So the initial phase is called, it used to be called Aviation Pre-Flight Indoctrination. Now it's called KNIFE. Um, I'm not sure what KNIFE stands for, but you essentially come out of college and go to like a 6 week classroom course where you learn about aeronautics and weather and stuff like that. And then after that, that's when you start flying and you go off to primary. So that first 6 weeks course, nothing a college student can't handle. It's just listen to the teachers, study the material, do well on the tests. But the actual flying portion is when it gets a little bit more tricky, and that's where you're constantly kind of making sure you're prepared for the flight, and that's when you have to kind of rely more on skills than just book learning.
So before we carry on, as a lot of people probably know, uh, pilots in the military oftentimes have call signs, and so I don't know when you got your call sign, but
Mhm.
I do like hearing aviators' call sign stories. So if you'd be willing to share,
Mhm.
Chewy, how'd that come about?
That's just like Chewbacca, big and hairy. So got that in my fleet squadron. That's typically where most naval aviators will get theirs, is in their fleet squadron, or at least the one that sticks. So I think I got off easy. Mine's just kind of about my person or my physicality. Usually it's something about something dumb you did or a funny story. So they can be much worse.
All right, yeah. Um, so then after flight school, you did start flying the F-18. Now, did you start flying the F-18 Legacy Hornet, or did you start with the Super Hornet?
I went right to Super Hornet.
Okay.
Yeah. So out of flight school, I selected F-18 Super Hornets in Virginia Beach.
Right. Okay. And in the movie, in the Blue Angels movie, which we'll talk about later, you did say the first time you take off, you have to push the I believe button. So
Mhm.
if you could just walk us through that first flight in an F-18, what was that like? Because I know it's a little bit of a big jump from some of the trainer jets. So
It
yeah.
sure is. Yeah. It's a huge jump from the T-45. And the T-45 is a huge jump from the T-34, which I flew. So propeller plane to a jet plane to a twin engine jet plane is essentially what path I took. And at that point, at least when you're in the F-18, you're pretty comfortable enough to fly a plane. So you're not really worried about that. But the jump from the T-45 to the F-18 is excessive as far as thrust. It's about, I don't want to screw up my numbers, but I want to say the F-18 is about 20 times more powerful than the T-45, just based solely on engine output. So when you put the throttles forward in the F-18, you know it, and it takes you by surprise, and it climbs much quicker and much faster. So you got to be very aware not to blow through your altitude on takeoff. But it's definitely a rush, and it's exciting.
Nice. So then you were in flying jets in the Navy for about 10 years, which I'm sure had tons of interesting stories and things that happened in those 10 years. But after, maybe about, say, 10 years, you put in an application for the Blue Angels. So what drove that decision to apply? And yeah, how did you come to that decision?
Um, that's a good question. So I think the Blue Angels were always something that in the back of my mind I thought would be fun to do. Even growing up, as every kid dreams of being in the World Series or doing this or doing that. That was one of the kind of goals I had in the back of my head. Never really expecting it to pan out. But then when I got up to about that time in my career and started reading around and seeing, oh, it is an option and here's how you do it. And figured the first time I'd just kind of throw my hat in the ring. I knew a couple guys who were on the team or going out for the team. And they kind of recommended I try it too. So went out there just to see if I liked it. I liked it the first year, didn't make it, but liked it enough to try it again the second year and got picked up my second year. So it was very exciting, but also not expected.
So when you got selected, you ended up getting the 3-year tour, which, as we'll talk about later, turned into a 4-year tour. But
Hmm.
uh, were uh, were you happy about that? Yeah, and did is that the role you wanted, or were you anxious to get straight into the formation?
Absolutely, it is definitely the role I wanted. I wanted to do the narrator in the solo spot. Um, I did not want to be in the diamond, but for many reasons. But yeah, I had a great time getting to do the narration spot, which I think is very unique because while the six jets are flying and Fat Albert's flying, there's only one person that gets to physically interact with the crowd, and that's seven. So I thought that was a pretty unique experience to be able to kind of watch them watch the show and tell them about it, which I enjoyed. And then obviously the solo flying is pretty hard to beat. So it was a great experience, and I was real lucky to get that.
Yeah. So then you progressed through the 2019 season, your first year, and then in 2020, like you mentioned, you moved up to number 6, the opposing solo. But then a few months into this, after winter training, COVID happened. So
Mhm.
how was that? You're number 6. You've just gone through 3 months of winter training. How was that now learning that you aren't going to get to show off what you've been training for the past few months?
It was very tough for sure. Obviously March hits and we didn't know what was going on. We just knew our first show canceled, so we came back to Pensacola, and then slowly but surely every kind of show starts to domino fall, and then yeah, we find out the whole season's canceled. But uh, I kind of have to temper it. It was frustrating, because we practiced that hard and that long to be able to do something. But at the same time, we were fortunate that we still got to work and fly, and we didn't really have, the COVID horror stories that a lot of people had where they were stuck in their houses for days or weeks or months on end. We were lucky enough that we were deemed essential. They wanted to keep our skills sharp just in case the flying got turned back on or we had to do something else. So we kept flying every day. So it was, mentally frustrating because you're going out there and you're practicing every day for something you knew you probably weren't going to do. But we were lucky that we actually still got to, be together as a group and kind of get through COVID together.
Yeah, and that year you guys also got to work on the transition from the Legacy Hornet to the Super Hornet, and you,
Mhm.
as you mentioned, were you started off flying in the fleet with the Super Hornet. So was that, and were some of the other team members had always flown the Legacy Hornet, and then was that easier for you having come from a Super Hornet background?
So the year we transitioned, almost everybody who was on the team that year was a Super Hornet guy by trade. So we were actually, yeah, we were new to the Hornet uh, in that respect for those couple of years. But we had guys, we call it our transition team. So we had some former Blue Angel pilots working on the Super Hornet transition, and a lot of them had Hornet experience, Legacy Hornet. So we had a good mix of everybody. But once we actually jumped to the Super Hornet, most of us were fairly confident and comfortable because it's what we'd flown beforehand.
So from what I heard, the transition had been in the works for quite a few years at that point. But
Hmm.
at that time, there, I guess, were some other aircraft that maybe were an option. There's, the F-35 at that time, the newer version of the Super Hornet, the EA-18 Growler had come on. Uh, was there any consideration for the other aircraft, or was it you guys knew it was going to be the Super Hornet?
We knew it was going to be the Super Hornet for various reasons. So obviously the F-35 would have been too expensive to operate and too new. So any new F-35 would need to go to the fleet for actual capabilities, right? Luckily with the F-18, it's been out for, at the time, it's been about 20, 25 years. So there are old Super Hornets we can pull from that don't detract from the fleet. And so that was a big factor in determining it. So obviously the fleet need their aircraft before we get anything. So the fact that there were some old rundown Super Hornets, or not rundown, but older legacy type models that we could pull from that weren't operational helps out a lot. And then this E18 is the same airframe as the F18, just with a couple extra sensors on it. So that wouldn't really affect anything. Um, yeah, there was no thought to pulling that one either.
Okay. And so I'm sure it helped smooth the transition that most of the people on the team at that time were already flying the Super Hornet. But were there any transitions taking a Blue Angel show that had been accustomed to Legacy Hornet and then making it fit with a larger Super Hornet?
Absolutely. So that was the big question we had, was making sure the airframe could do everything. And the transition team was running through. We had a couple of diamond guys and a couple of solo guys and one former boss running through those profiles. And so they were constantly in the simulators or flying the air shows just to see what issues we'd have with. And the short answer is no, there's no difference. The jets are relatively the same. The longer answer is yeah, there are a couple of things we had to tweak just because, if you think about the Legacy Hornet, it's an older, um, we'll say less smart plane, right? So it's a little bit more mechanically integrated. It's got some pulleys and cables in it, whereas the Super Hornet does not. It's all fly-by-wire computers and hydraulics and all that stuff. So when you put more computers into it, it's obviously going to take out the pilot a little bit out of it. So a couple of things we found, for example, if you're doing a loop in the Hornet and you just pulled the stick back and held the stick, the plane would fly a perfect loop based on where you had that stick. The Rhino's a little bit different. It's got a computer, right? So as you pull back, it's going to start flying up. And then as it slows down and the AOA or the alpha builds, it's going to kind of continue to hold that alpha. So it's going to shallow out the loop. So rather than having, like a perfect circle loop, it would go up and then end up higher than we started, which obviously we don't want for an air show. So there had to be some mechanical flying isms that we'd have to change in the show to make the show look the same. But overall, the aircraft performed uh, pretty much exactly the same.
Nice. So after that, after the 2020 year and into the 2021 season, you guys were able to come back and start flying the air show season. But at the right before the start of the 2021 season, I believe you had a little bit of a setback. You ended up being
Mhm.
grounded for medical. So what was that like to have to sit out after you've been, this is your first season flying in the actual air show, and now having the Super Hornet. What was that like to have to sit that out?
Yeah, again, that was tough. Yeah, so go through another six workup now on the Super Hornet, get ready to fly, and then right before the flight, yeah, I had an inner ear issue and had to step back for a little bit, and luckily had a team member come in to kind of fill my spot for a couple months. But yeah, it was definitely tough to again go through the six training and then not get to fly. But luckily, uh, everyone helped out, and there's kind of a team effort there. I was able to get back within a couple months and fly right back into the show. So at least I got to finish out the season.
Nice. And was it, I've heard other pilots refer to it as a perishable skill. Was that was it tough to come back after, a little time out of it?
Um, Not really. I think luckily was at the advance where I'd done it for 2 years almost. So I had that whole 6 year of practicing. So I think if I had just been a first year six, it would definitely have been a lot more trouble to come back and get spun up. But with having that extra year behind me under my belt, I was able to readapt pretty quickly.
Nice. And so you ended up finishing up the 2021 year, really, from what I've heard, not too many issues, and
Mhm.
seems like the Super Hornet had been working great. But then in 2022, uh, there was as probably a lot of people have seen, there was the Blue Angels documentary that was made, and you were one of the main features in that. So, what was it like to have a camera crew following all of you and showing your guys' mistakes? Because that must have been pretty hard, even just sitting in the briefing room talking to your friends about your mistakes, but then having a whole camera crew for the whole world to see. What was that?
Mhm.
What was that like?
Yeah, the camera crew is definitely different. I would say, ironically, people always ask me that. I don't mind them showing our mistakes because that's exactly what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? We identify what we did wrong and try and fix it. The weirdest part for us is having a camera crew there is obviously if you ever see the Blue Angels, we're always on a timeline, we're running, we are constantly moving. So when you have that extra camera crew there, they need time to set up, and they need time to break down, and they want to go with you, and they want so logistically for a fast-paced machine like the Blue Angels, it was a challenge to get them to understand, hey, we're moving, and you're welcome to film us, but you're coming with us, and you need to stay at our speed and come with us. Um, and obviously, most of us are not used to having cameras around, so that was a bit of a challenge to get used to. Of camera in your face or talking, and they always ask, "Hey, can we do this again?" We're like, "Nope, sorry, we don't do redos. We don't do take second tries. What you saw up there is what you get. You can try and capture it another day." But so once they figured that out, and we kind of got on the same page, it was great, and I'm glad they ended up doing or filming it because looking back on it, it's pretty neat to see kind of a video recap of it.
Nice. And they did a good job representing, like you said, representing what life is like.
Absolutely, they did, and that was one of the things they were actually really concerned about. Obviously, before we did the any filming, we kind of had meetings with each team, and they would hear our vision, we'd hear their vision. And one thing that was very cool about all those guys is they really wanted to showcase us properly, and they were all very concerned about either misrepresenting us or representing us in a way that we weren't going to like. Um, so they almost became part of the team as they traveled with us that year, and they took a lot of pride in the Blue Angel name and the Blue Angel documentary as well. So it was great to see.
Nice. And so then after the 2022 season, that was your last year on the team after 4 years. So that must have been that was a pretty big time in your military career, I guess, compared to some other people who were only there for 2 years. What was it like to leave that team that you'd really been a part of for quite some time?
It was very weird stepping back from that. I was fortunate, but very, like as you said, it is not normal to stay there for 4 years. So it was a great opportunity for me. But only a couple guys in the past years have been there as long as I have. So it's weird to step away from that squadron that obviously you put so much into and so much time into. But that's the fun part about the Blue Angels is you're only a blip on the radar. You're just there to carry the ball forward for the next team. And we know it's not a forever thing. As you're once a Blue Angel, always a Blue Angel, but you're not going to be there for forever. So your goal is to get the six jets and get the show to the next year and pass it off the torch and let someone else run with it.
Nice, but you didn't actually end up going too far from the team because you stayed in
Mhm.
Pensacola to be a flight instructor in the T-45. So
Yep.
how was it coming back to be an instructor after already being, a Blue Angel? That's probably about close to as high as you can get in naval aviation. So
Mhm.
do you think that made you a better instructor, having come from number five and being the lead solo training number six as well?
For sure. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of teaching techniques you pick up in the Blue Angels because people always say teaching can be hard, but when you have to teach your peers, it's even harder. So you're teaching your friends and people at your same level, sometimes people who are better than you or senior to you. So you do pick up a lot of teaching tips and tricks that definitely help you in flight training overall. But it was actually, I enjoyed going back to instructing. Prior to being picked up by the Blue Angels, I was a T-45 instructor for pilots. So it was nice to kind of get back in the same plane and the same phase of instruction and work again, this time in Pensacola.
And so, what were some things that you looked for in students? Like you would see a student flying that you were teaching, and you're like, this person has got it. They're going to be successful. They're good. They're going to be a successful pilot. What were some qualities that you looked for in them?
It's going to sound silly, but there's two things I always tell my students that the only two things a student can control are preparation and attitude, right? So everything else beyond your control, whether aircraft availability, how well you do in certain situations, but you can control how you arrive to the brief and how prepared you are. And as silly as it sounds, the best students I have found are the ones that show up to the brief prepared. You'd think that everyone would do that, but it's not necessarily the case. So if you're getting ready for a flight, make sure you know as much info as you can about what you're about to do, and I assure you, you'll do much better than the average person.
Nice. So, as I understand, you had been an instructor for a couple years, and then you have, as of a few weeks ago, I heard that you did separate from active duty.
Mhm.
How did that decision come about, and what's next for you?
Absolutely, yeah. So the last couple of years, decided it was time to kind of move on for me. And yeah, I'm separating from active duty, but I'm hopefully going to stay in the reserves and still do some instruction flying over the next couple of years. But I'll be moving on to fly for Delta. So I'm from Atlanta. It's always been my goal to get back to Atlanta. So it'll be nice to hopefully hopefully move my way up there.
So, are you going to be flying for as you said, the reserves? Are you still going to stay with the F-18? Because I don't know, are there any F-18 reserve squadrons in near Atlanta, or are you
There, there are F-18 reserve squadrons. They're up in Virginia Beach, actually. But no, I'll be applying to the T-45 reserve squadron in Pensacola. So same with VT-86. Hopefully fly with those guys.
Nice. All right. Well, I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time for being willing to do this. I've learned a lot. I hope other people will learn a lot from this as well. So,
Mhm.
yeah, thank you so much for being willing to do this.
My pleasure. Let me know if you ever want to do it again. Yeah,
Yeah.
happy to help and it's been nice talking to you.
All right. Thank you so much. It's been nice talking to you.
Yeah.